Hello and welcome to UnHerd Ideas. I'm Freddie Sayers. We are doing something a bit unusual today, or unusual for us, which is we're doing an emergency discussion given that Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, has stepped down. We will now have a leadership election for leader of the Conservative Party and new Prime Minister, and everyone is very excited about it. The corridors of Westminster are full with chatter, and we wanted to see if we could zoom out and try and take a bit of a different perspective. Beyond just the leadership speculation or the process or whose team you're on, does this moment actually signify something philosophically? Is it of historic importance? Does it mean that the populist experiment or the realignment that was contained within that has somehow run its course or was never going to work anyway? Here to help us understand that and try and dig a bit deeper, I'm pleased to say we have a wonderful panel. Claire Fox, Baroness Fox, who is, you're a crossbench peer, is that right?
Non-aligned.
Non-aligned, that's a different kind of title. Aris Rusinos, many of you will know from former YouTube UnHerd videos. And joining us for the first time today is UnHerd's very own Will Lloyd.
Hello. Hi.
Claire, can I just start with you? You were saying on the way here that weirdly, the atmosphere inside the Palace of Westminster, at least in the working bits, is kind of humdrum and a bit ordinary today.
Well, I think there's undoubtedly a sense of anticlimax to a certain extent. There's groups of people standing around clusters like some, student union, plotting and who are you, side are you on? And I watched the speech on a collective TV, there's not very many of those, with a lot of Lib Dems who were, huffing and panting and all the rest of it. And it was like very difficult to concentrate because the hatred for Boris Johnson amongst some camps is so intense. But that was it, really. And then the debates in the chamber,
the House of Lords chamber.
House of Lords chamber. The main one today was on sewage, and it's perfectly important. But it was like you realise that the important business, if that's the important business. But I was actually thinking that I'm involved in the schools bill debates, very critical of that particular piece of legislation going through. I was gathering my papers, thinking about what I was going to say next week at the report stage where we have to vote. And then I thought, well, what's the point of this bill? There's no schools minister. I mean, what do you do? I mean, they've just appointed James Cleverly, but he will have even less familiarity with this piece of legislation than anyone before him. And there wasn't much attachment to it from Nadim Zahawi, I have to say.
So is there, do you think, a little first lesson there, or first thought, which might be how disappointingly little it actually matters in a strange way, that somehow kind of changing the caste list at the top of a government like this, which is not really ploughing forward at great speeds, should we be cynical that it will make any difference at all?
Look, I think it makes an enormous amount of difference. I just was suggesting that Parliament and the palace, as it were, is a bit humdrum. I mean, there's lots of, as I say, frenetic, febrile chat, but that's not politics as I would understand it anyway. I've never thought since I've been in the House of Lords that's where the politics that matters is happening. And just to throw this in, just to get maybe the conversation going, I was standing around College Green and an older guy kind of came up to me and he said, oh, you're, Claire Fox, and I voted Brexit. And anyway, he choked up and he said, is it all over? I mean, is it finished? We've been sold out, right? And he was like, he wasn't the kind of guy you'd think would cry, but he was tearful. Then a young guy came up and said, oh, you're that Brexit woman, aren't you? And he said, I'm absolutely furious. It's a coup. They won't let out. Boris was our guy. And they weren't traditional Boris voters. So I won't rehearse the whole argument or discussion I had with them. But I think it means different things to different people, this. It's hugely momentous because those Lib Dems I was standing with, I can assure you in the House of Lords, think that's it for Brexit, right? That's it. Populism's done with. They sneered at me standing there, like you're one of them. We're going to have our day. So despite the matters of governing and the legislation going through, this, I think, makes a very big difference to politics. And that's what I'm here to talk about.
I'm going to come back to you in 1 second, because there's a lot to pick up there. But Will,
yes,
we're doing some scene setting here. Mm-hmm. You were also in Westminster last night.
Yes.
You wrote a little piece about it on
yes.
UnHerd. And the atmosphere then there was quite different. You weren't talking about sewage and carrying on with normal business. There was a sort of extreme level of excitement.
I did not have one conversation about sewage yesterday. but I was there with the sort of below decks, sort of apparatchiks, the spads, and they were all sort of Tory party functionaries, and they were delighted. They were incredibly happy that Boris had gone. You know, as you said, you sent me out there to go and report on this. It was a very tough job. Had to drink quite a lot of champagne. You know, it was very hard. And
why are they delighted?
I think what's interesting for me is that even, you know, as far back as last year or as far back as 2019, Boris for these people was essentially a sort of crowbar. He was something that could Parliament in 2019. And the crowbar has ultimately gone rusty, has outlived its usefulness. And the relationship was transactional. And I think that goes from MPs all the way down to the kind of people I was hanging out with. And they've had enough.
Do you not think there's also this, you know, you're hanging out, as you call them, the kind of below decks contingent. The depressing thing is how they're all just loyal to their master or mistress, ultimately. And so there's this sort of apparent loyalty, but beneath it, every single member of the cabinet, every single junior minister ultimately wants to be prime minister, and their little team kind of wants that too. And so you get a moment like this, and it's everyone can be hopeful again for a few days or a few weeks that maybe they're going to get a moment in the sun. Did you observe that?
Possibly a moment in the sun, but I do think that also the last few months have been personally very stressful for people, very tiresome for them. One young woman said to me, you know, how many sex offenders can we have in the party? And I think it takes a toll. And I think people have their friends and their family saying, you know, why are you involved with this? It was getting to that kind of stage. And, you know...
it was depressing for them.
I think it was depressing for them. And I think it was very much a case of feeling like, you know, the fish's head had rot, you know, the body was rotting from the top. It was that kind of thing. And they think that if they just, you know, decapitate, then everything will go back to normal, everything will be fine. Obviously, you know, not really sure that's the case, given everything that's coming down the track. You know, the train is coming towards us, you know, with inflation and all these other things, cost of living. But for now, or for last night, they were delighted.
Aris?
Yes.
I want to bring you in here. You wrote for UnHerd I think we could call it excoriating obituary of Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
Sum that up for us. I mean, you basically feel like he had a moment of promise, which he squandered.
Absolutely. I think he was... fate had granted him a historic role. You know, he had a historic mandate for almost total reform of our dysfunctional state, which is what Brexit was all about, right? People didn't vote because... No one voted for Brexit because they care about the single market or Polish plumbers or whatever. They voted for Brexit because they felt that the British state does not function to its full capacity, that the political system just does not work. The Westminster system does not work. And Boris, in some ways like Trump...
In what way like Trump? Because people bandy that around and I'm always not quite convinced by that, but in what way is he like Trump?
He's like Trump in that he represented a massive jolt to the system, that he could just come in and wreck it and rebuild it in a way that functions better for the vast majority of the population.
That was the promise.
That was the promise. So, you know, all these things like, oh, you know, Boris doesn't abide by Westminster's, you know, customs and codes and, you know, all the taboos and kind of, you know, petty rituals of Westminster. That was the exact point. Like, people are against Westminster as it currently exists, right? There's a huge amount of dissatisfaction with our current political system.
So he did the wrecking bit, but didn't do the rebuilding bit.
Yeah, so he was put in place for creative destruction. He did the destruction, but not the creativity, unfortunately. He was just entirely unfit for the role. He had no vision, he had no philosophy, he had no conception of what the British state should be, or, you know, what his function within it was, other than just staying in power for the sake of it.
Can I just defend the now ex-Prime Minister for once? I'm just going to take that role, since it doesn't seem to be that popular around this table. Was he really that much worse than previous Prime Ministers, than previous politicians? I mean, people say, as if it's a point of fact, that he was a liar. I mean, we kind of have come to expect a certain degree of lateral relationship with the truth. It seems to me quite striking that he has been removed by his own party after an enormous, less than 3 years after an enormous victory, for nothing in particular other than being a bit shit, as they see it. There's no big issue.
Okay.
What is it?
So the whole thing, like, a politician who lies. Wow, what a, you know, what an eventful crisis. Like, I honestly would not care if he just lied repeatedly to Parliament and the nation, if he was openly corrupt, anything, as long as he was competent. But he wasn't competent, and that's why he had to go. So all this stuff about, you know, all the like ridiculous Partygate, you know, like, did they share a packet of crisps? You know, like, it's all absurd. The whole Westminster rigmarole. He was put in place to kind of, as this bulldozer, would drive through this empty froth, and he completely failed.
But did you think he was ever competent? Because, you know, everybody, you know, the Max Hastings of the world, they warned us. They said, you know, even Charles Moore, Boris will always let you down in the end.
No one had any doubt. No one who voted for him had any doubt about his character and his personal failings. But
was he less competent than Theresa May, than Gordon Brown, than the previous prime ministers?
Yeah, I know, but this is like a box-ticking exercise, and I am actually completely in agreement with what you've said. I mean, the thing for me, although I wouldn't maybe use the word competent, the thing for me was that he took the mandate as a sense of entitlement to do anything that it ended up being were not the kind of promise that people felt that Brexit offered. And, you know, when you consider you know, Brexit was never an end. It was a means to, you know, like people never understand that. You know, all the kind of Remainers who say, what have you got to show for Brexit? But this was a kind of democratic, flourishing moment. An opportunity was given. As you said, I never thought he deserved it. I didn't think he had the character for it, and I always thought he was incompetent. But history gave him something, right? And he, as all those people who say he squandered it, that's really true. And I think the reason why those voters that I spoke to today were upset was not because they'd ever really... I mean, they're worried that his removal means the end of the promise. But it's not that they were kind of saying he's a great guy, I loved him. All the frustrations that we've had, and we, of course, have had the whole lockdown, suspension of civil liberties, but we've also had the COP26 celebration. You know, all these things that people are going, what's that got to do with anything? That wasn't what we were expecting. So what I think we have had is not that he could be held to account for things which, as you've indicated, historically, corrupt lying heads of state aren't necessarily like the shocker from the locker. If there was this fantastic vision for a free society, if we believed that he was a free speecher, if we believed that he was going to actually bring around a massive upheaval in the way that democracy was organised, or economic growth, all of these things just never, it just like dribbled away. And so what we were asked to do was to say that his sort of, you know, different kind of politician meant that we just had to indulge his narcissistic tendencies without the benefits of a philosophy that you could point to. So it became untenable to say, I defend Boris as Mr. Brexit, because he started to diminish what Brexit would mean. It seemed to just mean Boris getting his own way on things.
Yeah. So I was going to say, I mean, what was Brexit about? Brexit was about a fundamental popular dissatisfaction with the British state, with the functioning of the British state and its direction. And, you know, he had a mandate to radically reform the state, and he just presided over a period of just permanent crisis to no end at all, right?
So it's it seems like your critique is kind of lack of vision, but what Claire is saying is in a way that he kind of went soft. You're talking about COP26 and suspending civil liberties, that people thought they'd elected either a conservative or a radical, and instead they got a kind of same old centre-left technocrat.
One could argue about what the vision would be. What I'm saying is people didn't recognise in those things the kind of vision that they meant, and he was never really thoughtful, so it was a done deal, you know, a minute to midnight, the planet's going to go up in space. Like, people are thinking, oh, I didn't realise we'd voted an environmentalist. You know, that wasn't kind of part of the sort of radically reform the state. I'm in the House of Lords. You know, what's happening in the House of Lords? Nothing. Stuff full of people like me. I mean, where was that big reform agenda gone? Any of the possible things that could have happened haven't happened. And I'm saying that anyone would say, well, he was just about to start doing that, Claire, and then we had this pandemic. But of course, during that pandemic, we saw the suspension of civil liberties, all of this well documented by UnHerd, and a silencing of anyone who tried to query it, from a very centralised, sit at home, sit on the couch, give up all control and do what you're told by these experts. And this just it's not. I don't even want to get into what one's attitude to COVID was. I'm simply saying that any kind of promise that you would be central to the changes, which is what I think the populist revolution.
It was the
that's
opposite.
overstating it.
Instead of giving people more power,
A
they
sense
got
of
less
power. They got less
But
power.
we should have known, when he wins the election, where does he go? Where does he go on the train or in a car or whatever? He goes up to Sedgefield, to Blairland, and sort of repeats the 1997 Blair, what is it, like sort of, the sun is out again or whatever. And for me, that was like, oh, okay, that's a bit of a danger sign. And on something like environmentalism, I mean, because we're effectively dealing with a person who's a sort of cipher, look at his father, huge environmentalist, and look at his wife, huge environmentalist. They just go and do it.
Okay, I'm going to intervene again here because we were all there 3 years ago in the election of 2019, and it did feel like something quite momentous had happened. It wasn't quite up there with the Brexit referendum of 2016, but it was near there. And I think Boris was quite intrinsically intertwined with that moment because Theresa May had also gone up against Jeremy Corbyn, and although there'd been movements, she hadn't won to the same degree. There was something about Boris's strange ability to appear to be a different person to different people that meant that he was uniquely well positioned to unite these very different kind of groups of the coalition and win that majority. So the Brexit supporters of the North who thought it was one thing and the Brexit supporters of the rich Tory shires in the South both saw Boris Johnson and saw something slightly different. So that magic shouldn't be dismissed alongside, in a sense, it's the flip side of his personal failings, isn't it? It's his sort of lack of visible single backbone, but it was quite crucial to the whole victory in the first place.
You made you made a point about, one has to be careful about what we mean about the Trump thing. I was very sympathetic to the idea that he was almost he almost became the embodiment of the saving of Brexit, because it was saving it, and you have to remember what the mood was like in 2019. Why I made the extraordinary decision, for me at least, of standing for the Brexit Party, which was never in my game plan at all, because I was so terrorised it was going, right? And I didn't know what to do, and I did something like mad that was going to wreck my life, which it did. And it was like one of those things where you think, if we don't do this, they're going to stop Brexit. It's like really going to go. And as a consequence, Boris Johnson takes the helm, and because he's not your traditional politician, people did the most extraordinary thing, which is they broke with generations and generations and generations of never voting for the Conservatives. So when an upheaval happened, a political realignment was possible. But I think that one of the things that I suppose we all, I'm very conscious that I want to avoid is there is a danger as well of a psychodrama here, because it is the case that his character, he has squandered it. I want to hold him responsible. But I also am aware that from the very moment that he was elected, there was a determined effort, just as there was with Brexit, to discredit him. And this reminds me of the Trump thing. So it's like he was elected with an 80-seat majority, and everybody said, well, that's not legitimate. People were going for him. So the reason why there's sort of some suspicion about him having been, upended in the way that he has, is even though I can see that he has to take responsibility for it, people can see it as a coup, because they know that even when he wasn't doing anything wrong, people were determined that Boris was a populist who represented I've sat in the House of Lords from the beginning that I got there, and people have said Trumpian culture wars, representing the worst instincts of people, playing the dog whistle, playing to people's backward instincts. The majority of people, and that was Remainer, by the way, backbench Tories, Labour Party and Lib Dems, effectively hated Boris because of Brexit, which made it quite tricky when you were trying to critique Boris, not as Brexit, but as, for the online safety bill or for some other atrocious thing that he was bringing in.
Those people are celebrating today, right?
Yes.
So I think that is clear. And Will, you've done a special study of the Centrist Dad as a kind of political archetype. You've written about that. The Centrist Dad today is having a great day.
Yeah,
the wicked populist, all of the unseemly business is behind them. We got Rory, Stewart and Alistair Campbell celebrating on their podcast, and no doubt all of those people who kind of really feel power is rightfully theirs will be feeling hopeful today. Doesn't that make you feel a little bit peaked?
No, because I've started to think that, it's interesting the word psychodrama, I've started to be so disappointed with this government that I've sort of come to the realization that maybe some of these people were right about some of these things.
Oh, wow.
Not the centrist dads so much, but there's a thing Rory Stewart said in an interview in 2014, and he said, the secret of modern Britain is that there is no power anywhere. And I think we can see with this government that Boris couldn't find it, and all that was left was the psychodrama. The psychodrama, I think, was the point of the last 3 years. It's interesting with Brexit, because Brexit, I think Claire's got a really good point here, which is that because Brexit is so associated with Boris, Brexit c'est moi, with Boris, I do kind of wonder whether he's not only the person who made it happen, and it definitely wouldn't have happened without him, but I feel like he probably is also the gravedigger of it, because he's been so irresponsible and the character is so wrong that I think he's possibly also doomed it, and that may be his role in history, to both float the balloon up and then pop it.
So you're looking ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
And your forecast is that this kind of revenge of the centrists moment.
Oh, it's coming, yeah.
It's not, because we've been promised those before. There have been moments, they've been waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
But you feel actually it's an open goal now and they might triumph.
They may get bored of podcasting. Rory Stewart may get bored of podcasting. Tony Blair may get bored of running his ideas factory. These people are perennial in British history. I mean, there's Lloyd George wanted a Centre Party. I mean, it's been going on for centuries.
I'm going to have to disagree there. I mean, how did Boris get such a massive mandate, which he then squandered? How did he stay in power so long, despite everything? Because his voter base, the majority of the country, despises his political enemies, who are the centrist dads, who are the sensible, voice of continuing the old system, the way everything was. Nothing can ever change. That popular dissatisfaction, even anger, has not gone away, right? So, John the Baptist has left the scene, but there may still yet be a populist messiah waiting in the wings.
Oh, okay, so what you think Boris could have been the man destined to clear the way for the true one?
Well, you see this, going back to American politics, you see this with, you've got DeSantis, who's basically Trump but more competent, which, conservatives in the US are watching his rise with anticipation, liberals are watching it with fear. Do we have a similar figure? Probably not at the moment, but, the background dynamics haven't changed. And in the same way as fate or history, whatever you want to call it, vomited up Boris to his position, someone else will come to fill the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Important to note that that's why to concentrate just on one man, even though it's inevitable. I mean, first of all, he didn't deliver Brexit. I mean, in 2016, it was more of a hindrance than a help, actually, and that's not what happened in terms of that vote. I know that he then became the vehicle through which, in 2019, it got saved from being squandered. I do understand that bit, but when you were saying, Boris and Brexit, it's his enemies. He's tried to claim it as his, and his enemies trying to associate it. For those of us who know that neither of those things are true, it's very important we make it clear. But anyway, Brexit always was a different moment than people thought, because it was about leaving the EU, but it was so much more than that, as I tried to indicate, written about endlessly and so on. So I think what we might be seeing is the start of the end of the Conservative Party. I mean, we've just had the French elections, and we have to remember, that the two main French parties, what did they get? 7% between them or something? And that's relatively quick. We don't know what form this will take, but the Conservative Party, as it presently was trying to hold things together, was untenable, has been untenable, because most of the people who voted for Boris aren't conservatives in any... I mean, they might actually be socially conservative, but they're not Tory party types, and they're also, they've broken with the Labour Party now, and there just doesn't appear to be anything that holds those people together. And you can see it with the different types of MPs that you've got. And this isn't just like the old alliance. So I think that maybe that's ending. I look at the Labour Party and I see no possibility of a resurrection of any sort. But Labour, labouring people, RMT strikes, all this, it's not like as though that's resolved, right? And we're about to enter a cost of living crisis. And all around Europe, there are people, taking to the tractors, to the roads, to the streets, all sorts of things happening. So the real question is, has the populist instinct, and populist I mean it in the most positive sense, which is ordinary people saying we want to have a say in the way society is organised and take back some control, not just from Europe, but of our lives, and be taken seriously. Whilst they're in despair at the moment because they feel they've lost that moment, because Boris was their mistake in a way, but they kind of go, it's like, we hate him, but we want to decide when he goes. So there's a bit of panic. But I think that the instinct is still there. And to give UnHerd its credit as well, we've got to stop being nice to you. You know, when Partygate was happening, one of the things that made it clear that the technocrats and the, exist on all sides was, we're trying to hold Boris Johnson to account for parties in number 10, not the fact that people couldn't visit people in care homes, that hospital visits were completely stopped, that we weren't allowed to ask questions about the suspension of civil liberties and emergency powers, or ask any difficult questions about that. And the reason I'm saying that is because that's why I'm saying it can't be a psychodrama, because every single party and everybody at Westminster went along with all that lot. They went along with Boris on it, right?
But Claire, I think one of the things you just said there is really quite potentially exciting, which is that if this leads to a kind of actual final death or serious demise of some of the bigger political parties, it's this thing everyone's always talks about, and it never happens. And the sort of cliche is that in the British system, we're so used to these two main, this kind of duopoly, and it just goes between them. And in fact, the last election had the highest share of the vote amongst just those two parties for decades. So in a sense, if you're right, that maybe, just maybe, this will finally break that kind of two-party duopoly, it could be quite another creative and quite exciting moment.
It could be. I mean, the thing is, fate doesn't hand you things, right? All I'm saying is that the populist instinct still exists. This could be a negative outcome, by the way, because people could develop a nihilistic cynicism of a quite destructive nature. I mean, people are really fed up and furious and seething, and that's always not good in a way. It's not always good, at least. And I don't necessarily think I'll be alive to see the day when these parties collapse. I'm making the point that they can no longer hold it together in the way that they did. We have a Labour Party that does not represent anything about its historic mission, and therefore it has to go at some point. It's just that it might take a while. So I don't want to sound as though I'm like unduly optimistic and being silly about great, we've got a chance now. On the other hand, those people who think everything will return to normal are the kind of people who said, oh, what a relief, Macron's safe, all is well, a few weeks later, and it's like, oh my God, the French people appear to be not doing what we wanted them to do again, and they've now voted for Le Pen. How weird. So I think these things are bubbling under, and you've talked about America. Everyone's delighted, Biden's in, Trump's finished, the end of populism in America, and then it's like, possibly not. Because what's happening is a shake-up of post-war politics. History's on the move. We just don't know which way it's going to go. And I wish to influence it positively, but I can't guarantee it's going to be a positive outcome.
Will, you've talked about Emmanuel Macron en marche. It seems like what Claire was saying might resonate with that, which is that maybe that kind of moment might be happening here. Do you think so? Does that fit in with your sort of the worst fears of the revenge of the centrist dads, that maybe there'll be a kind of Emmanuel Macron figure coming up?
I suppose to contextualise it, I'm starting to see Brexit as a kind of Cromwellian kind of moment where you kind of have this failed revolution. There's a sort of settlement, which is much more of a fig leaf than a settlement, over this failed revolution, and then some sort of restoration occurs, which is the kind of historical analogy I was thinking of. And so I think the House generally wins in Britain. It's quite powerful, and I do wonder whether the En Marche thing does happen here with a sort of collection of sort of what's that guy called, David Gauck? What's he called?
Gauck, yes.
Yeah, you got your Gaucks, your Stewarts, all sort of clubbing together, big money behind them, big media, Blair, and they just sort of come back and say, look, calm is restored. And I do know what you mean about the anger and all of that stuff. But I do think we've gone through Brexit, we've gone through COVID. I actually think the turnout of the next election will be piddling. I think people are I think they are just, this whole thing has disgusted them so much.
Do you think
they're
exhausted, as Will suggests?
What I was going to say was that the pre-Brexit consensus that everyone was so tired of was a product of a very specific moment in global economic and political history, which has gone forever. We are entering a period of years, maybe decades of turbulence of a manner no one has experienced within living memory, right? Like, no one is prepared for the coming confrontation between China and the US. what we're seeing now with the cost of living crisis, which is actually really a result of geopolitical tensions between the West and Russia, that is just the tiniest glimpse of what will happen when there's real great power confrontation. So we're going to see plummeting middle class living standards that will probably never recover within people's lifetimes. The idea that people go back to this kind of normal Blairite, happy, optimistic consensus in that.
Not happy and optimistic, but I would say my only point would be that in the 20s and 30s, which is a similar time of strife, who's the prime minister for most of that in Britain? I mean, it's Stanley Baldwin. It's an incredibly boring, sort of stable figure, personality.
All I was trying to say, my analogy with Macron was just when you read all of those editorials that said, oh, peace is restored, Macron's back in, populism's over in France, and then like within 3 weeks it was like, possibly not. And what I'm trying to say is that people are wishing for things to be settled and calm, and even if that happens for a period of time, it's on top of a bubbling cauldron of and parties that cannot contain events that are not just events but sentiments that have been started. And I think that one of the things is it's the way that people want to go to, well, can we go back to before we called a referendum, when we all got on well and it was all a nice thing? Well, they might have thought everything was fine before that referendum, but the point of the referendum result was it indicated that just because you didn't see it doesn't mean it was fine. Now some of this has come to the surface and circumstances are much worse for ordinary people because we're facing a range of challenges, to say the least. So I simply think that we've got to be open-minded and not assume that some kind of restoration is possible. That's the way I see it.
I'm not pro restoration.
I know you're not. But I'm saying I don't think it's feasible. But I don't know what forms these things will take. And people say, who do you want to be the head of the Tory party? And you kind of I've got so little interest in that in many ways. But what I'm very keen to emphasise is just that Brexit, what drove Brexit's not over, and it's almost like those people who don't understand that are missing the historic moment very badly.
You mentioned the leadership race. We're not going to be picking candidates at this discussion or disappearing down that wormhole. And I agree at this stage it's kind of uninteresting. But if we can look at it more philosophically, what does conservatism actually mean now? I think that is something that it's remarkable how few people have an answer to. And if you spend any time talking to members of parliament, they don't especially either, I don't think. I wonder whether this leadership election that's going to come will expose any real deep thinking in that group of people. Probably not. It seems, at least if Boris Johnson is the evidence we have to go by, that it's a kind of fudge, a bag of snakes of different kinds of instincts and impulses that don't necessarily go together. Some of them wanting to change things, some wanting to basically preserve the status quo. Are they liberals? Are they actually conservatives? Does anyone here have a sense of what the modern Conservative Party is actually for?
I'm not sure there's much left to conserve. That's the problem. So, again, going back to the American example, if you look at how the Republican Party is developing, you could almost say, people talk about it in post-liberal terms. You could actually say it's post-conservative, because what it's doing is it's pretty much openly reactionary in the sense that it's using the power of the administrative state just to roll back all the kind of liberal innovations of the past decade. So we've seen abortion happen already. That fusion, or rather that sudden conservative realisation that actually the state is an immensely powerful tool and you can use it to impose your will on the nation. And your job isn't just to kind of quietly say, not now, not yet, try and slow down their onward path of progress. I think...
You think that's real and that's staying?
In the United States, I think that's real, and in the same way that American political trends come to Britain, I would be very surprised.
So your prediction, if that's what it is that the way the Conservative Party will be more, authoritarian? Will be more about grabbing the levers of the state?
But yes, more status. I mean, look, going back to global trends, talking about this, the state is going to be back in a big way. We're entering, like I say, a period of huge crisis, and the only way states will survive is by massively increasing their power.
Sounds terrifying to me.
it's unfortunate, but that's the way we go, right? So if that's the scenario, and I believe it is, then you have two options. You can have one party in charge of the state and imposing their vision of a good, well-ordered society, or you can have the other party do it. And whatever your political beliefs, you want your own side to win.
Claire Fox, this is kind of contained within the Brexit debate, isn't it? Whether those people in that group were for small government and government getting out the way, or whether they were actually for quite a big radical interventionist state. Where are you on this?
Well, I think it's sometimes discussed in that way. I don't think it was necessarily conceded that. I've always said that one of the things that, in terms of state intervention before Brexit, was that people were fed up of being done to in that kind of nanny state way, and I think that continues. They kind of felt that they'd lost their agency, and but the point that you're making about the big state, I think, is certainly the state is grasping power to itself, and one of the terrifying things about the lockdown period was obviously that it learned how to. It was justified in doing that everywhere internationally, and experimented with that, and it's been hard to grasp that power back.
The Chinese
in terms
model.
of liberal, well, just the executive powers that they wouldn't give back, they still, got the nudge unit, all of these things, well rehearsed before, so not to repeat. What I think though is different, which we need to talk about, what might emerge, is what the argument is surely is then philosophically what the challenge to that should be, because is it that I think we've got to stop thinking like the past, so if you can we build new arguments around fighting for freedom and liberty and free speech and agency and autonomy, without it meaning that you're saying that I don't want the state in my life, I'm a big state or a small state person. Do you know what I mean? Because I just end up feeling like I'm having an argument with the IEA or some free marketers, and I'm not really interested in that. I would like the state to intervene in some instances. There's things the state could do purposefully that would be very positive and progressive as far as I'm concerned, particularly in terms of energy, for example. They should be like ploughing ahead so we can have a cheap, efficient energy source. They could be having a massive, they should be building towns, not just building new houses. It's like, I want 6 Milton Keynes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And if they led that, I'd be all with them, right? So I'm not like one of these people who thinks the state shouldn't have anything to do with it. But where the state is wielding its power, where it says, we're going to police everything you say,
is there not?
I just
want to put one thought in here, which is, in a way, what you're saying is yes to the power of the state, but in order to improve people's freedom and agency. So, in a sense, that can be a test. And maybe this is a new kind of conservatism or new kind of thinking, where you say yes, we should use the radical power of the state, but only where it makes people have greater agency over their own lives.
So, going back to 2019, if Corbyn had got in. So we had, Sajid Javid, in his resignation letter, kind of praising Boris for, saving the country from the menace of Corbynism. If Corbyn had got in, do you not think he would have used the power of the state to the utmost extent? Of course he would. And you know what? Maybe he actually would have done a better job of it than Boris ever was capable of doing. At least we probably would have got, nuclear power stations and, nationalised utilities and, new towns and, housing infrastructure.
The head of the
Would
armed
still be in
forces,
lockdown, probably.
the head of the armed forces, MI5, MI6, like the entire sort of like British deep state despised him. The civil service would have been exactly the same as they were with Boris and Brexit. Yeah. I mean, it would have been the same floundering situation. Anything that the British state thinks is an extremist, it will try and reject. It will try and eject, I think.
But actually,
But this is
I don't see
this is the Dom Cummings
Yeah,
line. So
well,
what you mean is actually you're in favour of making the state more powerful, in other words, better, more productive, more efficient, more able to do things and function.
I don't know. All I would say is, just to take it back very briefly to conservatism, they've accidentally somehow historically found 3 things which make them quite popular. They're all quite negative things. Keep Labour out of power, keep public order, and keep property safe. That's steady state conservatism in this country. That's all they really do.
But they don't do it.
Occasionally they cut taxes. I mean, that's basically what they do.
Yeah, but they haven't done that very successfully.
No, they're not doing it very well. But that's what I think generally sort of aim for.
No, but
and they'd also do what a zoologist would call sort of aggressive mimicry, and they will steal things from other people.
But the problem
that's
that
it, really.
No, but you've
I'm not ambitious for them.
No, but you've just made the point that if Jeremy Corbyn had got in, which I don't want to counterfactual history, but if he got in, these forces would have set into play. I mean, one of the things that, and I don't want to sound like Jacob Rees-Mogg, but there is a real problem with the civil service, which is there's sections of the state that are just at the moment refusing to do things. Yeah. And I mean, this is like a crisis, right? I mean, I hate the Rwanda project. That is a scheme. I don't like it, but I do object to people going, we're not doing that. And we work in the Home Office. It's like, what do you mean you're not doing that? And no wonder people get frustrated. And we know, I mean, I know that the issues around trans and gender and so on are quite controversial, but it's like a passive-aggressive moment in the House of Lords, like people walking around particularly with lanyards, glowering at you if you're a gender-critical person. You're thinking, the hell are you, right? And they're like in the Bill's office writing things. I mean, all sorts of people all over, not just the Lords. I'm just saying there's lots of things going on where you feel as though there is no control. They've lost control. So the state has lost control of bits of the state, if that makes any sense. Yeah. I don't think it's coherent at all.
And to bring it back to Boris, his promise was to sort that out. Or he was supposed to be the guy who brought the state back into function and got rid of those obstacles.
But we know that actually because this is the difficulty that we've all got, is that he actually allowed a lot of these things to happen. In fact, sometimes encouraged them and had no sensitivity to them going on. And that's the incompetence bit. But you keep asking about conservatism. I mean, I'm not a conservative and I don't care. I mean, what no, but I don't care if they never find a philosophical heart again. I mean, wouldn't get over it. But what I'm saying is new philosophical ideas have got to emerge in this period that will offer people opportunities to choose between different options. Now, the difficulty at the moment is if people imagine that some kind of technocratic centrist dad moment will suffice, it's a bit like when you ban on free speech and you sort of say, you ban an idea, it doesn't go away, it goes underground. If people pretend that you can kind of calm things down, it's all centristly lovely, all that they're doing is forcing people down rabbit holes underground, and who knows what will emerge. And it doesn't always emerge in the way that one would want to in a positive way. Right. So I'm suggesting that we need to have, why wouldn't I say this? I'm the Academy about this. Have much more open debate and discussion. These kind of discussions, what kind of philosophical options should we give people? What kind of, and influence whatever shells of party are around. And I don't care what they look like. I'm not sectarian about that because I think they're all awful, but I'm just prepared to keep giving them good ideas. And if they steal them, all the better.
We're going to end with me asking one question to each of you, which is there anyone, we're not talking about picking favourite leadership candidates, but you can if you like. Is there anyone that you're excited about looking around the potential people who might replace him, or even in the wider penumbra? Is there anyone to feel hopeful about? Can anyone think of anyone?
Jeremy Corbyn.
No,
I mean that's telling in itself.
Anyone but Tegan Hat. No, I could live with Rob. I'd be enthusiastic for Gove, but that's not
What's the name? Claire Fox?
I think goes over, but he's got to be part of the government because the only one who knows how to. He's the only one who knows how to run anything, yeah. Right? And actually, what he's been doing in housing, just to make a point on the leaseholders question, which I'm passionate about, has been good. And every department he's gone and he's done something interesting.
So why not him?
But because he's been completely all over the place and unreliable, and he really did nearly sell out Brexit through compromise, and that was like unforgivable in my opinion. But anyway, look.
Anyone else?
I could live with Rob. The number of people who say this, and this is ridiculous, is David Frost is like one person that in the House of Lords has been actually genuinely like an interesting person that you want to have a conversation with, who seems to have some ideas, although he's a Tory guy.
Steve Baker?
That's yours, Freddie.
I get it, and people would feel relieved, and people don't want to remain out. And Tom Tugendhat I know that all these people will emerge and say, I know that I was a Remainer, but you can trust me on Brexit. It's like Starmer.
It's definitely war if Tom Tugendhat wins.
But it's a militaristic moment. That's what I was going to say. Is they're all going to come out and say, "Trust me, I'm safe." There is no one. That's what's depressing.
Will, give us a name. Anyone?
No, definitely. I think frivolous option would finally exercise the ghost of Margaret Thatcher, because she'd come in and inevitably fail because she's not Thatcher. Would be Liz Truss. So I also think that would probably.
Is this a sort of nihilistic impulse to see maximum carnage?
It'd be fun to write about maximum carnage, anarchy.
What about if you actually want the best for the country and the world?
Fun to write about. I love that.
I'm kind of with Aris on the bleak world picture. I'm not sure it makes that much difference. Sorry.
Well, thank you to Aris Ristanos, Claire Fox and Will Lloyd, and thank you for tuning in. As you saw, I ducked the question of which person I would prefer for the leadership. Don't know yet. I'm observing with interest. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd Ideas.